Welcome everyone to ODI. I'm Andy Norton, I'm Director of Research for ODI. A couple of quick announcements before we get into the programme for today's event. And this includes me. Could you turn off the ringers on your mobiles, please? And if a fire alarm goes off, it's not a test, so just leave the way you came in. And if you need bathrooms, they're that way, down the corridor. So anyway, welcome everyone to the launch of this report, Strengthening Social Justice to Address Intersecting Inequalities. Chiara, we have someone here from the MDG Fund, don't we?
Yes, SDG Fund,
Yeah,
I guess.
SDG Fund.
Felipe Santos
Felipe
here.
Santos, okay. Felipe, this work was supported by what used to be the MDG Fund and is now called the Sustainable Development Fund. Felipe, would you like to say a few words just before we start?
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning to everyone. On behalf of the Sustainable Development Goals Fund, I would like to thank ODI for the organization of this presentation. It will help to raise, no doubt, important aspects to take into account when putting the new development agenda post-2015 into practice. First of all, allow me to apologize to the director of the SDG Fund, Bruno Moro, who unfortunately is not able to stay with us today. The SDG Fund is a new development cooperation mechanism which builds on the experience on the MDG Achievement Fund. Indeed, the SDG Fund is the first fund created specifically to achieve the SDGs, the set of goals that will define development cooperation until 2030. Established between UNDP and Spanish cooperation for making a smoother transition from MDGs to SDGs, we are already dealing with the practical aspects of making development sustainable. In this regard, one of the innovations of the SDG Fund versus the MDG Fund aimed at ensuring national ownership is to bring additional partners through matching funds. Apart from traditional donors, this will allow our new programs to bring national governments and private sector commitments. To ensure national ownership as one of the principles of the Paris Declaration is one of the pillars of the SDG Fund, as well as in the past was the case on the MDG Fund. This one, with the reform process of the UN known as delivering as one, and the achievements of the development goals are the outline of our work. In this context, one of the significant contributions of the MDG Fund, as Bruno Moro pointed out in the foreword of this report, was the promotion of applied research and analysis with the scope of achieving a better understanding of the nature and context of poverty, and consequently, the design of public policies and development programs better equipped to address the core reasons of inequalities and exclusion. It is under this umbrella that the Fund and the Overseas Development Institute started its collaboration. First, with the so-called report on intersecting inequalities, coordinated by Naila Kabir and published in 2010, and now with this publication, Strengthening Social Justice to Address Intersecting Inequalities, which goes a step forward. From the analysis, also quote Bruno Moro, it strongly emerged that devising policies that are relevant for addressing extreme poverty and inequalities is not a technical exercise of finding the right mix of interventions. It is also a matter of promoting justice and rights, enhancing inclusion and participation for all groups of the population, and ultimately of achieving a more effective democracy and a better state. Paradoxically, in our time, when many countries are qualified as middle-income countries because of their economic growth, the increase of inequalities is a reality demanding an answer and especially asking for measures to improve the situation of the most vulnerable people. Tackling inequalities to advance in social justice, as shown in the report today discussed, is essential for its future. We would like especially acknowledge the leadership of Bruno Moro, former director of the MDG Fund first, and later of the SDG Fund. As I already told you, he couldn't make it to be here today, but in the last 2 years, he has worked hard to discuss this report internally at the UN and specifically with the Office of the Case Study Countries. He also actively reviewed the different versions of the documents. In the coming weeks, we will announce our new programs where the SDG Fund will try to contribute through the combined expertise of UN agencies and its national partners to put into practice some of the key findings of this research. I'm not going to finish without a specific gratitude to the government of Spain, which through the Secretary of Development, Mr. Gonzalo Robles, and ICID, the Spanish Cooperation Agency, supported financially the work of both funds, the MDG Fund and now the SDG Fund. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Felipe. Yeah. And we very much appreciated the collaboration with the Sustainable Development Fund throughout, which has been excellent. And we have on the panel to come both Naila Kabir, who you mentioned as the author of the 2010 report, and Leila Saad, who was instrumental in the commissioning of this report as well. As you were implying, this report followed up on the framework that Naila laid out with a series of country case studies. The basic question at the time was to dig into what factors lead to sustained progress over a period of years in one of the hardest things to do in development, which is tackling the situation of those who suffer multiple deprivations, the most excluded, and so on. We are also launching today a briefing paper which focuses with a little more sharpness on the Sustainable Development Goals, and that question specifically in relation to the Open Working Group draft of the Sustainable Development Goals. But thank you very much indeed for that introduction, Felipe. There are two parts to today. The first is a brief presentation of the work that's in the report and also in the briefing paper. And then we have a panel discussion following that. And also, of course, time for questions. I'd like to introduce the three presenters for the opening segment of today. Chiara Mariotti, who is one of the report's authors and is a research officer with the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network. Chiara is an economist and also an author of the Chronic Poverty Report 2014-15. Also, a pleasure to introduce Amanda Lenhardt, who is now a research officer with Development Progress and specialises on rural livelihoods, agricultural development, and measuring multidimensional poverty and inequality. And Amanda did a lot of the quantitative work that was in this report, or led that. And finally, Leandro will also be on our panel. Leandro Vergara Camus is a lecturer at SOAS, who has also taught on development and international political economy at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, and has a long track record, particularly of working on politics, social movement and social change in Latin America. Chiara, would you like to start the presentation?
Okay, well, thanks for the introduction, Andy. The presentation. All right. Okay, so as has already been said, this report was funded by the MDG Fund to follow up on research that Naila Kabir, who is joining us in a moment, did previously on intersecting inequalities, and I'm going to clarify in a moment what we mean by intersecting inequalities. Don't worry. What the report does is looking at the experience of 7 countries that are Brazil, Ecuador, Bolivia, Ethiopia, Nepal, India, and to an extent also Pakistan, to identify the key ingredients that are necessary to address intersecting inequalities. And in this sense, it's the result of a team effort that was written by different authors inside and outside SOAS. So it's based on these case studies that then were put together in the final report. And Leandro later will tell us something on the findings of the report, more specifically in relation to the Latin American case studies. Here is Naila. And also we will have Amanda telling us something about the quantitative analysis that was done for the report. And in particular, this was done to initially select countries that had some measurable record in addressing intersecting inequalities. All right, so what are intersecting inequalities? In a sentence, we make reference to the multiple disadvantages that certain groups of people face, and in particular those people who face deep inequalities in reason of their very identity. And to understand it a little bit better, it's useful to compare it to vertical and horizontal inequality. So with vertical inequality, we just group people and then we rank them by one particular indicator or outcome, and we compare these outcomes, the dispersion of these outcomes among all of them. Horizontal inequalities, we compare groups of people by a certain characteristics, and we observe how they differ for one particular outcome. With intersecting inequalities, we still group people by certain characteristics, but we focus on those who fall into certain overlapping categories. So, for instance, on indigenous women living in rural areas. And in particular, we focus on those characteristics that are ascribed from birth, that are immutable. So gender, race, caste, to a certain extent religion, but that depends. And so the idea is that there are groups of people who have one or more of these identity markers that come with certain type of disadvantage, and the intersecting, overlapping of these disadvantages constrain them in their life chances more than other people. I think Amanda is going to tell us something on how we measure intersecting inequalities.
Yeah, so one of the challenges in understanding the way in which intersecting inequalities manifest and also how they've progressed over time is a lack of empirical evidence on these particular groups. And as well, some difficulties around how to actually measure this, because it's quite a complex concept that we're trying to understand. And so for this reason, we carried out some quantitative analysis to try to first identify those intersections in countries where data was available, and also to track what changes have occurred over time. So in order to do this, we used demographic and health surveys for 17 countries which had available data for both 2 points in time, but also more challenging is to have a marker of social identity. So for example, someone's described ethnicity or language. This limits the number of countries that we could look at. But we did use those 17 countries that did have this information, and we tracked what changes had occurred over time in years of education of women, as well as child mortality rates faced at the household level. And the intersections of identity that we looked at to track this were individuals' income categories or wealth categories as measured by the demographic and health surveys. Also, whether or not they lived in a rural or urban area, as well as their individual ethnicity, or in some cases we used language as an approximation for lack of data. So we tracked these two indicators with these three intersections over time using a general entropy measure, which, briefly speaking, is we compare group averages to the overall average of the country to identify what gaps there are between them and the rest of the country. And so I'll just speak briefly about some of the findings that came out of this analysis. First of all, we found that the poorest people, the people living in the bottom quintile of a country, intersected with their group identity, were the most likely to have been left behind by progress that we've seen in health and education in these countries. And by this, we identify this because only 5 countries by looking at this intersection, experienced some decline in the spread of individuals' education and child mortality. And those 5 countries that did experience some reduction in inequality by this measure, that reduction was very marginal. It was less than 1 percentage point. In 5 countries of the 17 that we looked at, we found that inequalities between individuals' wealth groups and whether or not they lived in a rural or urban area decreased over time. And in this intersection, we saw the largest decrease across countries. So people living in the poorest quintile and living in rural areas were catching up to the median or to richer categories in their country. And finally, in 8 of the countries that we looked at, the impact of the intersection between an individual's ethnicity and living in a rural or urban area also declined across these 2 survey periods. And so overall, 3 countries stood out from the analysis where reductions across all forms of intersecting inequality decreased over time. And these countries were Ethiopia, Bolivia, and Benin. We also identified Nepal for the report as well. Although we didn't see a significant decline in intersecting inequalities in Nepal over this period, the survey period covered a time of conflict. And so we saw that Nepal began with a low level of inequality, of intersecting inequality, and maintained that low level over this period. And this was partly used to identify the case studies that are looked at.
I think it's worth saying also that we didn't have data for every country we'd have liked to look at.
That's right.
So, I mean, for example, Brazil, we couldn't look at, I believe. So it's just worth a comment.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so the review of countries that we did for the report revealed that our case studies shared 4 key ingredients that were necessary or useful, at least, to address intersecting inequalities. First of all, social mobilization and social movements that demand a change in the rules of the game. And then trajectories of political change, and then also of constitutional change, constitutional reform that somehow enable these changes in the rules of the game. And then political participation that comes with these changes in the rules of the game, with the changes in the political trajectories and the constitutional reforms. And then a number of policies and programs that show commitment to reduce reduce inequity and exclusion. And in particular, universal and targeted programs combined with affirmative action. And I'm going to illustrate briefly each of these 5 elements. And we start with the trajectories of political change that promote equity and inclusion. And we can summarize the experience of our case studies as reflecting 2 main trajectories. One is that of governments that have a strong redistributive and progressive agenda that is combined with class-based social mobilization. And our key examples here were Brazil and Ecuador, where the government actively created links and supported and maintained the links with social movements as a strategy then to maintain political support. And of course, re-election of Dilma Rousseff yesterday, probably it's a very good example of this. And I'm sure Leandro will have more to say. And the other trajectory is that of multi-ethnic countries in which there is a movement-based government that is the result of identity group mobilization. And our examples here were Bolivia, Ethiopia, and Nepal. So Bolivia with the traditionally excluded indigenous majority that eventually managed to elect one of their leaders as a president, Evo Morales. And then in Nepal, where a government emerged from the 10-year-long Maoist rebellion, and this government was demonstrated to be quite committed to address inequalities, also making use of affirmative action. And then in Ethiopia, the ruling coalition of the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front is an alliance between the main ethnic groups that then has progressively co-opted also the ethnic minorities. Now, what are the lessons here? Obviously, these trajectories are not prescriptive, they are not deterministic, or they are not exclusive. But what can we learn is that there are political arrangements that work better to enable the implementation of policies that then are good to promote equity and inclusion. And the point is how we achieve these political arrangements where there are things that a government can do, like develop a national project that generates a broad consensus around progressive policies, and then having the support of political parties and social movements to then deliver this project, and then keep opening spaces for participation of the civil society, and keep enabling social mobilization. Which then leads to the second element of our model, if you want, which is social movements that have managed to maintain, to construct links with political power. And if simplifying a little bit here, we can say that social movements can be seen as acting as a threat factor or as an incentive for democratically elected governments. We can see social mobilization acting as a threat in Nepal, where the 10-year-long Maoist rebellion then led to peace agreement that included the formation of a constituent assembly that guaranteed the representation of minorities in the constituent assembly itself, and then also an interim constitution that tried to address the grievances of the Maoists, some of the grievances of the Maoist movement, with specific measures, and in particular with affirmative action. And then in Brazil, we can say that maintaining the electoral support of the social movements that were supporting the PT-led government acted as an incentive for the government to enable then all the progressive policies that has been implementing. The lesson here is that maintaining social mobilization of some kind is needed for progressive governments basically to stay so and to keep up to their promises. Then how do you maintain social mobilization? That not easy, but things that can be done by the government are keep creating links with civil society, in particular with the marginalized groups, and trying to open space for consultation on specific policies and programs, and also keep maintaining open flows of information. And third thing that we found in our case studies is that these governments that are underpinned by a long-term social mobilization tend to mark the passage to this new political discourse and policy making with constitutional change. I've mentioned the example of Nepal already. The other example that we had in the sample was Ethiopia, where with the 1995 new constitution, the country was turned into a federal country based on ethnic federalism, and also some provisions, some legal framework were created for promoting decentralization. Now, decentralization is far from complete in Ethiopia, and certainly the model of federalism has been criticized for lacking democratic accountability, but we did find that these provisions created with the constitutions contributed to decrease inequalities. As Amanda was mentioning, Ethiopia came out from the quantitative analysis as one of the countries in which there have been a stronger reduction in inequalities. Lessons, what can be done? Well, obviously, the extent to which a new constitution does bring about transformative change depends on the extent to which the political coalition, the government in power is willing to turn those provisions into actually implemented policies and laws. Two things that can be said is that it is important to get right those constitutional provisions in the sense that they need to be ambitious and challenge the order, and then they need to be context specific, and then once again they need to be written and designed in strict consultation with the civil society. The fourth element is the political participation, the increased political participation that comes with political change and constitutional reform. And indeed, rewriting a constitution is basically a unique opportunity to create spaces for political participation where they didn't exist, and in particular for those groups that didn't enjoy any participation before. Our examples here are India, the amendments done in India in the 90s to improve the political participation, especially at the local level, of women, of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. And then again, Nepal, with the Constituent Assembly being elected on the grounds of a proportional system with quotas that ensured that women and Dalits and low caste were almost for the first time represented in a legislative assembly. In terms of policy lessons here, well, how you promote political participation through constitutional reforms, that again is context specific, but our examples tell us that mechanisms can be proportional electoral system, decentralization, and then also involvement of civil societies in policy consultation. And this is more the example of Latin America that I think Leandro is going to talk about. And then I have the final element that has to do with the different universal and targeted programs, and in some cases also affirmative action measures that governments committed to tackle intersecting inequalities have implemented. And in our sample, we had on one side Brazil and Ecuador that have been more focused on universal social protection programs, trying to reach out to the groups that had been previously excluded. And then on the other side, Bolivia, Ethiopia, and Nepal that had a more mixed approach. So they tended to mix universal and targeted programs. So for instance, in Ethiopia, we've seen that the universal provision of public services advanced with the fiscal decentralization, and at the same time, Ethiopia had one of the largest social protection programs in Africa, the Productive Safety Nets program, that, you know, it's a public works program targeted to the poor with cash transfers for those unable to work. Lessons here, that in a sense is that there are no lessons, in the sense that each country will have to mix these according to its own needs. But one way of maybe, one general rule is that to address that tension between the universal and targeted programs, one way to go is to provide, or maybe the way to go, is to provide basic transfers in cash or in kind to the poorest, to those most in need, and then promote universal provision of basic services for everyone. Two other quick things to say is that two things to ensure that these programs are implemented in the long term and are expanded to scale is first starting with one good program that then act as an entry point for other interventions. And our example here was Pakistan, where with the Benazir Income Support Program, which is an unconditional cash transfer program for women that was implemented starting with door-to-door census to track the beneficiaries, and then the assignment of poverty scorecards. And this mechanism has been highly inclusive because it enabled big flow of information. So people knew about the program from each other because of this door-to-door approach, and this improved the outreach of the program and also a certain level of transparency in the delivery then of the transfer. And another positive effect was to give an incentive for women to apply for a national identity card, because this was one of the requirements to qualify for the program. And then the other thing, no, sorry, I'm still on this slide, that really is important for the proper implementation, for the effective implementation of these programs, is for it to be supported by a legal framework that does recognizes rights and guarantees of minorities. And the case study that we analyze in the report here is India, that in the 2000s has seen a number of laws recognizing civil, social, political, and economic rights. Most notorious examples are the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act in 2005, the Forest Rights Act in 2006, the Right to Education in 2009, and the Right to Food in 2013. I'm missing some, but there are more. That really builds a big framework recognizing rights and guarantees for all. Now, of course, there are problems with implementation in India, but it is important. This framework is important because it gives a legal grounding to these policies and programs that aim at promoting social justice, and also it recognizes the responsibility of the state to recognize these rights and guarantees and to implement them. And I'm going to conclude saying that the key conclusion, one of the key conclusions of this analysis is certainly that addressing intersecting inequalities require social and political mobilization. That's certainly not something that you can achieve with exogenous or top-down intervention. But we also think that these findings show that there are some concrete things that can be done, that a country can do to start addressing intersecting inequalities, and there is no need to wait for the entire transformation of the society. And of course, these concrete things that I've talked about largely apply to the sphere of national politics and national policy making. But there are also things that can be done at the global level to motivate and to monitor action then at the national level to address intersecting inequalities. And I'm not going to say much about this because this is going to be the topic for the panel discussion later. I just wanted to highlight the 4 things that we discuss in the briefing paper that Andy was mentioning that we think could be done to reinforce the traction of the SDGs framework to tackle intersecting inequalities. And these are measuring progress towards the SDGs, focusing on the 5, 10, and 20 on the bottom 5, 10, and 20% of the population. And then because this is going to take time and to be a gradual process, then set stepping stone targets at the national level for narrowing the gaps between the relevant groups. And then, of course, strengthen the information and the statistical system to gather data on these marginalized groups and possibly also build specific indicators. And then also, because this is an area still a bit neglected in the SDGs, to set a target to ensure that the poorest 5, 10, and 20% have access to adequate, sufficient land and housing. And yes, and I think I'm stopping
That's
here.
great.
Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Chiara. Leandro, do you want to say a few words about the work that you led?
Yes.
Ecuador?
Yes. Thank you very much, Andy. We were invited to join the report writing, not in the first phase, but in this later phase. And I want to say a few things about the process itself that Chiara has not said. What I really want to thank ODI for inviting us to be part of the report. I say us because there was a co-author with me. Paula Evia Pacheco was responsible for Ecuador. I was responsible for Brazil. And what was interesting about the process was that this is not a normal report, a regular report. You'll see what you have in your hands is very political as a report, and it comes out of a genuine discussion between people that did their case studies without having like a political agenda behind it. We had no sort of policy orientation. We simply wrote our report on the achievements, the difficulty, the institutions that these governments were putting in place, and then we came together in a 2-day workshop, and we discussed what came out of these cases. And these cases brought out the things that Chiara was mentioning. So it also is not a regular report that says this is what should be done. And I think those kinds of report we've seen a lot, and I think they're not necessarily are useful. So we looked at the achievements and the policies of Ecuador and Bolivia in terms of addressing poverty and extreme poverty, and then intersecting inequalities and exclusion. So we looked at quotas. We looked at the creation of institution for participation into policy. We looked at cash transfer payments. We looked at several types of policy, and what comes out in terms of achievement for the case of Brasilia and Brazil is that they have actually achieved quite a lot. In terms of Brazil, in terms of extreme poverty, when the Lula took power, poverty was at 37.5% and extreme poverty was at 13.2%. And in 2012, it was 20% of 0.9 in poverty and 6.1 of extreme poverty, which is quite extraordinary for this short amount of time, in 10 years. In Ecuador, it's also impressive. In 2002, 49% of the population lived under poverty and 19.4 in extreme poverty. And in 2011, those number was 32.4 and 10.1. Most of this reduction was thanks to cash transfer payments. So it was mainly carried out through universal social policy, and mainly by expanding these policies, and also doing a little bit more in terms to try to reach the people that had not been reached in the past. And Brazil here stands out, and the report mentions it. In Brazil, they created this sort of new mechanism that is called active search, in which the Ministry of Social Development organizes teams of state officials that will go out and seek people to get registered into the cash transfer payment. And by doing so, it allows to reach people that normally wouldn't be reached. So the elderly women from Afro-descendant background, people living in very isolated rural areas. So that was sort of the doing a little bit more than the regular cash transfer payment. In terms of the targeted policies, we looked at quotas and but the participation of social movement and NGOs in policy design. The results in terms of the quotas are much less impressive than with cash transfer payments. In both cases, they've been put in place very recently, so the results are probably not yet tangible. There's also a sort of a reticence from these governments to strongly put in place these quotas. In terms of what was impressive about these governments was the new spaces for civil society participation. And in these two cases, the one that stands out is actually Brazil, more than Ecuador. Ecuador is the process is still rather recent. Correa was elected in 2007, spent most of the first year organizing the Constitutional Assembly, and then the new constitution was enacted in 2008. So it's still fairly recent, but the case of Brazil is different. The constitution in which the progress was based was enacted in 1988. And it was a constitution in which social movements had participated greatly. It was at the moment of the transition to democracy. So a lot of the social clauses were put into the constitution in '88, but it was only with the PT government that they started to be used and became the basis of policy. So sort of echoing what Chiara was saying is that you may have very interesting constitution and principles if you don't have a civil society and a political party that is willing to put these principles into practice. Well, it will probably stay on paper, as many is the case in many Latin American countries which have incredible constitution, but actually doesn't lead very far. What also was interesting in the case of Brazil was that the PT government created special secretariats, one for women and one for racial equality, that was directly linked to the executive and had the responsibility of putting the agenda of intersecting equality on the table for all the ministries. They had also responsibility to do national campaigns, national plans, and bring in social movement in the process. So these secretariats also function as interlocutor between the state and civil society. The case of Brazil also is very peculiar because the 1988 Constitution had created these councils that were supposed to be civil society and state spaces in which policy would have to be reviewed or discussed. And it was, again, only the PT government that sort of launched this process. And what you have in Brazil is that each sort of ministry or issue is debated in national conferences, each 2 to 4 years. And before going to the national conference, people go to their municipal conference, then they go to their state conference, and then delegates go to the national conference. So you have a process, very large process of participation in which people get a sense of what the policies are, what should be done, how much funding there is. And out of these conferences come sort of orientation for policy. And the state, in certain cases, is more or less obliged to follow these plans, or in other cases simply use them as guidelines. So you have an institutionalization of civil society participation, which is very, very broad-based. In the case of Ecuador, they also tried to do this to a certain degree by creating what they called National Council of Equity. The process has been going on more or less unequally. Some regions have managed to organize these councils, but at the national level, as far as I know, until 2012, they hadn't decided yet on the format and they hadn't gone forward. And this is mainly due to the different type of relationship that the Correa government has with social movements, which is actually a very conflictive one since a few years, in contrast to the very long relationship that the PT government or the PT has with social movement. The PT was created as a party of social movements and has maintained a lot of sort of communication with the movements. And actually, within the government, you have ex or still social movement activists, which gives the PT government a different kind of look, if you want. In terms of the results, like I said, poverty, extreme poverty has been reduced. Intersecting inequality, there's still a lot to be done. The institutions are there, but the will seems to be less than to addressing more universal kinds of inequality and exclusions. The limits, though, to these achievements are that, first, they are based on renewed and renegotiated revenues from extractive industries. So Ecuador is able to do what it's been doing because it's standing on oil. And it's using the oil revenues to fund social programs. Brazil is more or less in the same situation, although it's much more diverse as an economy, but most of its export is still based raw resources and agricultural products. So if we think of sustainable development, these are not actually, there's not a basis for social sustainable development. And it tells a little bit about the volatility of this type of model. The other important thing to say about these governments, and it's not only Ecuador and Bolivia, it's also and Brazil, it's also Bolivia, Venezuela. All these new governments, new left-wing governments, have actually not totally broken with neoliberalism, but actually have recovered some kind of role for the state within the economy, which is also not something that all developing countries can do. For example, Correa was able to renegotiate the oil royalties, was able to renegotiate the debt. Brazil is using its development bank to fund and support its domestic economy. It has raised domestic debt. It has brought down foreign debt. So these governments are also playing much more with the options in terms of economic, macroeconomic policies and industrial policy than other states have. But again, it is to a certain degree fragile because it will depend on the conjuncture and on maintaining high prices for raw resources. The other maybe limitation or sort of shortcoming is that these state policies, the cash transfer payment actually, are not yet fully state programs. They're still very much based on the government in place, right? So in order for them to really become the basis for long-term poverty reduction, they have to become state programs. So every government that comes in will have to continue these programs, and that's not yet the case. The other important limitation is that reducing inequality and poverty through cash transfer payment is really limited because there are no transfer of assets. So the more contentious issues of land reform, for example, or tax reforms, the control over for example, the control over natural resources, community control over natural resources when I'm thinking about indigenous people's right over natural resources. All those issues are have not been dealt with. So the structural reforms that I think are needed to really address issues of inequality have not been taken up. And if you look at these two countries, the inequality between groups is still very important. Chiara was mentioning the issue of the lower decile. If you look at still Brazil and Ecuador, the lower decile has actually not improved at all in these times. So there's several limitations to these cases. Maybe just to finish, what is important also in the difference between these two cases is that in the case of Brazil, the social movement, like I said, have had a long history of pressuring the state, have had plenty of time to institutionalize, refine their strategies. In the case of Ecuador, it's not, the social movement have actually not had the ability to pressure the state as much as they had in the past. And Correa, to a certain degree, has used the social movement discourse for his own agenda, and social movement have actually been marginalized from the process.
Thanks very much indeed, Leandro. That was a very rich presentation. Thanks also very much to Chiara and Amanda. In the interest of time, I think I'll ask you to hold your questions, comments and thoughts until we've had a chance to hear from the panel. So maybe we can do the switchover at this point. But while we're doing the switchover, Andrew Shepherd is here, who led much of this work. Andrew, do you have any thoughts you want to add at this point before we move on to the panel?
Okay.
Can we
Thank you,
get a mic over to Andrew, please?
Sure.
Are you going to switch over while I talk?
Yeah,
or-
yes,
Yeah.
if we could. Yeah.
I suppose I'm to try and give you a transition.
Thanks, Andrew.
I think the one thought I have is that, as Leandro mentioned, this report wasn't like many of the reports that we do from ODI, and it had a much more, well, had a very political overtone to the analysis, and I think that creates quite a challenge in thinking through how it relates to the process that is now ongoing at the international level of developing these sustainable development goals. It's not easy to think about how that diagram, the elements of that diagram, get transposed into the goals. And in a sense, I don't want to throw out too much of a challenge to the panel. I don't expect you to solve the problem. But in a way, that's where the discussion now, I think, should move, really. We've tried to identify a few of these kind of key ingredients, but how can they best be represented in an international process like the one that's going on? I think that's an interesting topic, and I'll return the microphone
Thanks very
having
much.
accomplished the
The
transition.
transition,
Thank you.
yeah.